Hello, and you're watching the History Fella channel. In this video we're looking at the James boys. Frank and Jesse James were born in Missouri, the sons of Baptist minister the Reverend Robert Sally and Serelda James. At the beginning of the Civil War, Frank James joined the Missouri State Guard and was wounded during battle for Lexington. He was left behind when the Confederate Army retreated and was hospitalized by the Union Army. He was paroled after swearing allegiance to the Union and allowed to go home. After recovering from his wounds, Frank James ignored his parole and joined up with a guerrilla band known as the Bushwhackers. Under the command of Fernando Scott, he later joined Quantrill's unit and was involved in the infamous Lawrence Massacre. Whilst with the Bushwhackers, Frank was joined by his brother Jesse, who had initially joined up with a local group known as Drew Lobb's Army, who were involved in the Battle of Wilson's Creek. During the battle, Jesse was seriously wounded, causing him to be hospitalized. Once he'd recovered, he joined up with his brother Frank, and together they fought throughout the remainder of the war with guerrilla units. Initially with the Bushwhackers, and later with Bloody Bill Anderson and Quantrill. Towards the end of the war, when Quantrill's raiders were being hunted by both the Union and the Confederacy, Jesse suffered a serious chest wound when they were ambushed by a Union patrol near Lexington, Missouri. He managed to get away and was able to recover at home, or at the home of his uncle in Harlem, Missouri, where he later met up with his brother Frank. With the Civil War over, the James boys suddenly appeared again in 1866, when together with the younger brothers they robbed the Bank of Liberty, Missouri, getting away with $15,000 in gold and $50,000 in non-negotiable securities. After bagging up the money, Jesse James locked the cashier and the rest of the staff in the vault, threatening to shoot them if they tried to escape. During the gun battle that followed, an innocent bystander, a young lad, was shot and killed. 1 year later, they struck again, this time in Savannah, Missouri, and during the robbery, killed the local judge, William McLean. 2 months later, they attacked the bank at Richmond, Missouri, which resulted in the deaths of the mayor, the sheriff, and the sheriff's young son. Over the next few months, the gang robbed the bank in Russellville, Kentucky, where they stole $14,000, and then again at Gallatin, Missouri, where they killed a bank clerk who dared to try and stop them. With the whole state looking for them, the gang went into hiding, and it was to be over a year before they went on the rampage again. This time the gang headed into Iowa and held up the county treasurer's office in Corydon, and then robbed the local bank of $10,000 immediately afterwards. They stole the Kansas City Fair takings in 1871, and the following year they moved to train robberies. Their first was the Rock Island and Pacific train, which was attacked a few miles outside Adair, Iowa. The gang stole a tie hammer and a spike bar from a railroad shed, where they used it to pry off the fish plate that connected the two rails of the track. They then removed the spike, securing the rail, and tied a rope around the loose section of track and hid behind the bank and waited for the next train. As the train approached, they pulled the rail away from the track, expecting the engineer to halt the train before the gap in the rail. With full brakes applied, the train screeched to a halt, but it was too late to miss the gap. To the horror of the gang, the engine and most of the carriages fell onto their sides in a sickening sound of metal crushing against metal. In the ensuing crash, the engineer was killed and the fireman injured when the engine overturned and crushed them. The gang entered the express car and stole just $2,000 from the safe. then went to the passengers and stole a further $1,000 in jewellery and cash, all the time explaining to the terrified passengers they had not intended to hurt anyone. In the next couple of years, the gang robbed stagecoaches and trains. They then split up and went their separate ways. Newspapers and writers back in the East picked up stories about the gang, and the tales of their exploits were greatly embellished. Magazines appeared telling stories of the James Boys' daring deeds, and that they were the Robin Hoods of their time, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. Nothing was further from the truth. They were a pair of murdering criminals who kept their ill-gotten gains within their family and had little regard for human life. Despite numerous attempts by sheriffs and US Marshals to catch them, they always seemed to be one step ahead all the time. Then on a cold night in January 1875, Pinkerton and railroad detectives were tipped off that the James Boys were hiding out at the family farm. Seeing movement in the window, they threw a lighted turpentine ball in through the window, followed by a 33-pound bomb. Some reports say that following the explosion, Frank and Jesse James burst out firing as they did so, managing to escape. Other reports say that they were not even there, and that there was just an excuse to cover up the fact that a 9-year-old boy was killed in the explosion, and that the mother of Frank and Jesse James had her right arm blown off. When news of this atrocity leaked out, the myths surrounding the gang took on more appeal, and sympathy of their exploits grew. However, most local people feared and loathed the gang, and this turned to hatred when in September 1876, the gang, now reformed, rode into Northfield, Minnesota, intending to rob the bank there. The James Boys and younger brothers and 4 other members of the gang entered the bank and shot one of the clerks dead when he said he couldn't open the safe. The robbers had failed to notice that the safe was already open, so the killing was unnecessary. The alarm was raised, and as the gang ran out of the bank, the citizens were waiting for them and opened fire. 2 of the gang, Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell, were shot dead in the street, and all 3 of the younger brothers were seriously wounded, only the James brothers escaping uninjured. All 3 younger brothers were tried and convicted and sent to prison for life. Bob Younger died in prison, whilst his brothers Cole and Jim were paroled in 1901 after serving 25 years. The hunt for the remainder of the gang intensified, and 2 weeks later, Medelia, Minnesota, one of the gang, Samuel Wills, aka Charlie Pitts, was shot dead by a posse after they cornered him and the rest of the gang. Frank and Jesse James escaped and split up, Jesse heading for Mexico whilst Frank went to Texas. They later joined up, and for a while the 2 of them rustled cattle across the border, but then decided to make their way back to Missouri. Word of their returning reached the governor of Missouri, T.T. Crittenden, and he was determined that one way or another he was going to put a stop to the James brothers once and for all. He offered a $10,000 reward and assigned Clay County Sheriff James Timberlake to take care of it. Timberlake immediately contacted 2 of the James brothers' distant cousins and former gang members, Bob and Charlie Ford, who he knew had been involved in the planning of a couple of bank raids. He promised them full pardons, and if they helped in the capture of the brothers, as a bonus, part of the reward money. There was no love lost between the 2 sets of brothers, and when the James brothers returned to the family ranch, the Fords notified the sheriff that they were going to take care of them. Frank James, in the meantime, had moved on, leaving Jesse James at home with his wife and children. On the 3rd of April 1882, Bob and Charlie Ford went to Jesse James's home. Jesse's wife was in the kitchen, and Jesse was standing on a chair to straighten a picture, when Bob Ford pulled out a nickel-plated revolver that Jesse had given him and shot him in the back 3 times. Bob Ford was arrested for murder, tried and found guilty, but was immediately pardoned by Governor Crittenden and given the reward money. Bob Ford was killed on the 3rd of June 1882 by a drunken gunman when he opened a saloon in direct competition with another saloon, something to which the owner took exception. 5 months later, Frank James walked into the Governor's Crittenden office, calmly unbuckled his gun belt and placed it on the Governor's desk. After a number of trials, he was acquitted, despite there being strong evidence that he was involved in a number of killings. It appears that his early war record and the general feeling of disgust at the death of Jesse James and how he had died was instrumental in acquitting him. Frank James never returned to the crime and died in 1915 at his family home.